Hi folks, it's Jeffrey Shaw here, and just above me is Allan McKinnon, and he's here from Brisbane, and just directly below me is my co-host and friend, Julia Chai. As you can see, the Dreaming the New Dream tonight is for Koala's sake with Allan McKinnon. And Julia's actually, what's the best way? Meet and greet and discovered him and said, I think we should get this guy on the radio. And I think, well, we've had another fellow guy called Greg Chappell who came on last year. He was an animal whisperer. And I have to say, he was an awesome fellow. But this one is a bit different. We're actually going to be talking everything associated with koalas. And I'm quite sure we're going to talk about other animals as well. So anyway, yeah, 7 o'clock, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria. It's 9 o'clock in our friends in New Zealand, 10 o'clock in the morning in the UK. And for our friends in the United States who are still asleep, you can watch the show later. Good evening, Julia.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's episode of Dreaming the New Dream. We're delighted to have Allan McKinnon join us. Allan McKinnon has dedicated at least 18 years of his life specifically to taking care of our furry and extra special friends in Australia, the koala. And apart from the koala, Allan is a trained, qualified vet and actually started out life being the National Animal Welfare Manager for the New Zealand government. While he was doing that, he got very interested in epidemiology, which is looking at new emerging diseases from wildlife, Hendra virus, Lyssa virus from flying foxes, mad cow disease. And we're very lucky to have Allan relocate from New Zealand to Australia. But I think that's actually a really good thing because New Zealand is actually at the forefront of taking care of animals, and they also declared a river to have legal person rights. So I think in this case, in this sector, Australians can actually learn a lot from New Zealand. So we're delighted to have Allan come onto the show and talk to us about the current plight of koalas and all the other animals that are facing extinction in Australia. Welcome, Allan.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. So I guess, I think last time I went to Europe, everyone was talking to me about the bushfires and the 1 billion animals that got decimated. And since then, we still occasionally have headlines about where people are discussing whether corridors should be built for koalas that are being displaced by new development. You've worked at the forefront with orphaned koalas that are being picked up from the street, koalas that have been burnt. And over the years, how would you describe the situation that is faced by koalas in Queensland today?
What I find really interesting in this area is that we're very good at documenting what's happening, but not taking the appropriate action. So, like, we've got a lot of information about where the koalas are, what their needs are, and they're very specialised animals, and they have very specific needs. And if those needs aren't met, well, the populations are just crashing and disappearing. And so, having spent all that time patching up animals and putting them back into the wild, it's like this feeling of like I can remember one particular case we had. We were treating in the hospital, and it was there for probably 6 months. By the time we went to release it, all the habitat had disappeared. The land where this animal lived had been cleared, and we're dealing with an animal that's highly territorial. So you try and put it somewhere else, but it wants to go back to where it's come from. So because of the special needs of koalas, and because they're so specialised in what they can feed on, it's very difficult to just go, we'll put them somewhere else, we'll move them somewhere else, we'll find a better place for them, because it just doesn't work that way. So what that comes down to is that we have to look at how can we protect their habitat and make sure they've got a functioning habitat so that they can survive there.
Well, I have to say, I went for a little tiki tour, it's a New Zealand expression, on Sunday down to the cane fields down here between Brisbane and the Gold Coast. And when I came back out of the cane fields and I saw these little enclaves, particularly in Pimpama, I could not believe the encroachment of suburbia and the massive bloody warehouses, particularly in Bunnings and the shopping centres. And I'm thinking, geez, it's like 20 years ago that was still cane fields. But I mean, when you're talking about out past Ipswich and Camera and further out Ripley and places like that, and Springfield, you can understand why they've been completely devastated. And
so there's one statistic that's worth remembering, and that is like, if you're going to have a viable population, you need to have at least 500 animals so that you don't get sort of inbreeding and genetic defects. So if you've got a nice little habitat and you've got your local population like 10, 12 animals, they're not going to last. They can't breed their way out of that. So what we're seeing is this fragmentation of the environment that's really causing a lot of problems for these animals.
And that's where you're saying, because we came down on the Pacific Motorway and the highway, and you're saying that koalas just can't cross motorways very well.
Well, human beings can't cross it. I wouldn't try.
Yeah, that's right. But and that's why they've been wiped out at that area. So and koalas are creatures of habits.
Yes.
And they will tend to walk through the same paths that they know. And you were actually telling us a good story about one of these developments coming up overnight, and the woman was in her living room, and the door was open because it gets very hot here, and we just leave the doors open so that the wind can blow through. Do you want to take over the story?
Yeah. So, eating a dinner at the kitchen table, and this koala just walks in the front door, down the passageway, past her, and out the back door, and that was its usual track before the house was built. So it's still there. It's like, it's amazing how they don't seem to sense that things have changed, and that there's possibly danger. There could be a dog. Crossing roads is always difficult for them. So it's kind of endearing, but also quite sad to see that sort of thing.
It's a fact that most animals, particularly whales, have that migration pattern working on the magnetic fields. Birds work with magnetic fields. Aborigine folklore and so forth talk about the caterpillar trail or the crocodile trail or the song lines where they actually follow the path. So, I mean, what you're saying about the koalas makes a lot of sense.
And you were saying that because they're such creatures of habit, if we, the government tends to open up land for development, and then they try and offset, so they'll try and relocate the koalas to a different habitat. But you're saying that rarely works because the koalas just tend to, land in the new place, and then they start walking and start trying to get home, go on walkabout.
But there's another thing that koalas have got a unique physiology that one of the things that happens, the young joeys grow in the mother's pouch because these animals are marsupials, so they grow in there, and they just the mother's milk provides all they need, and they get to a point where they need to start eating leaf, and at this point the mother actually produces this soft fecal pellet, and that's got all the bacteria that this baby koala needs to digest eucalyptus leaves. So this, from its mother, it gets the microbiome so it can eat the local eucalypts. So if that animal's moved into another area, it may not necessarily be able to digest or adapt so easily to if there's different trees. That's apart from the whole territorial nature of the animals when they want to come back to their home turf.
And that was actually how I met you, Allan. We both were. You were leading an initiative to plant more eucalyptus trees. And a lot of my friends and neighbours actually will do that. There's a list of eucalyptus that we know that the local koalas want to eat.
Yes.
And they're diminishing. So if you want to help, it's just a matter of planting the right trees at the along the back line of your fence.
Yeah, well,
So
that was,
that any lost koalas can sort of hang all across.
so one of the
And the
things we've been looking at, and I'm not sure what point it's up to at the moment, is that we've had specific people are involved in forestry looking at whether they can select a dwarf eucalypt, because eucalypts traditionally in Queensland can grow really big, and they're a threat if they fall on your house or drop limbs and do all this sort of stuff. So if you could have a dwarf eucalypt planted in your backyard along the back fence line, then you're actually creating a natural corridor for the animals that can move through. And they'd be very happy. They do survive quite well in suburbia, and they're quite happy in their little patch, providing they're not disturbed. Yeah.
So we're talking, Allan, about what we can do to help them, obviously pick them up or monitor them in your local community so you know where they do cross the road, and maybe provide protection for them. What is actually the Queensland government doing, or the local government doing for them? And I know you worked for the local government as an animal welfare officer for quite a long time.
So what we're looking at is we've put a lot of resources into the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. Like we provide hospitals. We've got rescue groups that come and pick up animals. They'll get up in the middle of the night and rescue an animal that's been hit on the road, or someone's very distressed because their dog, which never bothers anybody, has attacked a koala that's come into their backyard. And so that's one aspect of it. It's like, to me, this is treating the symptoms of what the problem is. The big issue is the total loss of habitat, and the fact that to provide housing and roads for people, we just seem to have to completely denude the landscape. And once that landscape's gone, it's irreplaceable. Like one of the ways we try and justify this is that we'll provide offsets. So I'm going to cut down this prime habitat, the trees that have taken hundreds of years to grow, and I'll let you, and the government will let me plant some other trees in some other place to offset what I'm doing. And so those trees are going to take 100 years to grow properly. So the big concern that I have is that we're not sufficiently in tune with the environment to protect the environment. And if we're worried about koalas, we need to protect their habitat. And the current legislation is we have a lot of rules and regulations about animals and what you can and can't do, but without the trees, the koala's just not going to survive. So we have to have an overall view of protecting this environment. And when we do this to protect the koalas, we're also protecting all the other animals and birds and reptiles and invertebrates that live in that natural environment. But it's really hard because in Australia, there's like the traditional area where koalas were found was all down the east coast of Australia. They don't occur in Tasmania. They don't occur in Western Australia. They don't live in the tropics. They don't live out in the desert. They live along this coastline, and like the prime koala habitat is where everybody wants to live. Like 80% of human beings in Australia live along the coastline within like half an hour of the beach. So our relentless pressure is pushing these animals out of their natural home, and this is only going to be worsened by climate change. The predictions are that the koala distribution is going to shrink, southerly and easterly, because they're just not going to survive out in the drier westerly areas.
And do you see the government doing anything to stop that happening? I mean, it is our national iconic animal. All the visitors and tourists want to see it.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. What's interesting, some of the latest research, and I think you've got to give the government credit, is that they're definitely supporting research into this area. And like we can just document this decline. Like we can just say, like, we know why it's going down. And so one of the things that people are saying is that the best way that we can protect animals is by integrating them into farming onto farms. So farmers who looking after the land and are gaining a living off running livestock have also got areas where they can have trees, and this is probably an ideal place where we can put koalas and protect them. They're just hopeless at crossing roads. They can't protect themselves against dogs. In the city, they'll survive fairly happily in suburbia, but they're also under a lot of threat. And as soon as they're on the ground, they're vulnerable, and they have to get on the ground every so often to go and go to another tree to get the leaves that they need.
Hey, Alan, there was a large property not all that far from here, 20-something acres, and in fact, the farm was quite substantial originally and became a suburb called Shale Park, named after the family. So the remaining property that was left, the pressure by the council in terms of rates for that individual family the pressure was getting too great. My recommendation to them was to actually rezone and give them a new zoning and call it like an agricultural zone. I mean, they can have rural, but something special in the sense that 20 acres could have been a habitat that the council didn't have to pay for because the family knew how to work that property and then reduce the rates accordingly because of and make it more affordable for them to stay on the property, but also the fact that it adjourned a daisy state forest. So there's big mobs of kangaroos and koalas there. You could always see the possums coming through, and the koalas, But the council was just looking for the dollar. Forced those original homestead families to sell and move on. And that's what obviously I've seen down here at Pimpamo and the cane farms. So there's too much financial pressure on those individual families to stay on those properties. They need to rezone, bring down the rates.
So what you're alluding to there, Jeff, is like we've also got to look at connectivity. So if we've got this spot and it's beautiful habitat and it needs to be connected, and the fact that it backs onto Daisy Hill State Forest is perfect. But if this was in some other part of this area, then we need to look especially along creek lines, we need the connectivity so the animals can move, so that they can, there's enough animals there that we've got that genetic stability. So this is the other thing. We can develop our new suburbs and we can put in new roads, providing that we make some allowance for the wildlife. So providing we maybe supply an overpass or an underpass. Underpasses don't work for koalas because if they're on the ground, they're vulnerable. But so it's looking creatively. How can we create these corridors and these connections between these remnants of bush? And I guess my real plea to the government would be like, don't go trashing, the remnants that we've got. Surely there's cleared land already that we can build on or do things with.
And I guess it's also a change in attitude, isn't it? It's the young ones talk about genocide
Yes.
of the environment, and I think to a certain extent they're right. We're just raising down landscapes and biomes at the expense of animals and for the benefit of humans. And one of the cases that we were discussing earlier was just the caged chickens, but that's been under discussion for sort of over 2 decades, and it still hasn't been outlawed. And that's simply because when it comes to profit and feeding humans, the animals just don't seem to get those rights that humans do. But if we were to change that, and if the population was to say, no, we want to live and be guardians and take the guardianship role of taking care of the animals that live in our in our habitat, rather than just taking the land away from them, which is really what we're doing, then I think there'd be more cooperation and ability and potential for people to, sort of factor that in when they're planning new developments and create the spaces.
Well, I think the underlying issue is that a lot of people see themselves as separate from nature. They're not part of nature. And when you feel that you're separate, then it's like you become a lot more just there for yourself. You become more like, as long as you're okay, that's all that matters. And what's becoming more and more obvious is that we can't see ourselves as separate, and we can't hope for a technological fix. I'm mainly talking about climate change now, and this is like, we can talk about koalas, but one of the biggest threats for them is climate change. So the actual chemistry of the gum trees is going to change. We're going to have more one of these raging bushfires, and the leaves are going to become so nutrient deficient and leathery that the animals are going to have trouble surviving. So they'll survive well in zoos, and we can provide plantations, and we can feed them in zoos, and they'll survive well there. But they're going to be more and more under stress in the environment. So basically, what we have to do is start looking at our approach to the natural world and what we're doing to it through our activities. So this to me is the underlying cause for all the issues that are happening at the moment.
Mm. And apart from koalas, you've looked at other animal species, haven't you? You've been involved in projects to rehabilitate. What was it, the hairy-nosed wombat?
Yes. Yeah.
But tell us more about that.
This was something that took me quite by surprise. I wasn't aware of it when I first moved to Australia. That most people know the common wombat, but there are two other species of wombat which are much bigger than the common wombat, called the southern hairy-nosed wombat and the northern hairy-nosed wombat. And sometime in the 80s, a small group of these northern hairy-nosed wombats were found in central Queensland. And at that time, they were rarer than the panda. Like everybody gets really. Whereas these guys are in Queensland, they're on our back doorstep, and no one's paying them much attention because they dig these massive burrows, which sometimes you can fall into a hole. It's more than 2 meters. So it's they cause problems if you're a farmer. And so by running, I don't know if there is a northern hairy-nosed there, one of these bigger ones here. What we're involved with was there was this group of a few hundred on a farm. So the area was turned into a national park, and it was seen to be very, very vulnerable. You're getting them down the bottom there now, I think. So the plan from the government was to set up a second colony. So at the time we were trapping these animals and looking at them, but we didn't know how they would handle being moved. So this is an amazing thing. You've got these really rare animals. They've always just lived in this one little spot, and we're going to take them and put them, we move them down to St. George. And by flying them there, and we didn't even know if they would handle going in the plane. So it was really quite nerve-wracking to do it, but it was also very rewarding once we got them to this other area and we could start this second colony, because otherwise it would just take one natural disaster and the whole population on the planet could disappear just that easily.
I saw that. It was on ABC or SBS.
Yeah, Flight of the Wombats.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was interviewed in that movie. So
yeah, it's good, eh?
Yeah. No, it was pretty incredible.
No, I know where I saw it. Daisy Hill.
Oh yeah. Okay.
I got it up there. Yeah, it was really good.
And they're actually, those wombats actually related to koalas. Yeah,
they're the closest relatives to koalas, and the the fascinating thing I found out about these northern hairy-nosed wombats is that they've got this incredible metabolic rate. That the big advantage for them is that if they're living underground, they've got a constant environment, so they're not under any pressure. Like the humidity is constant, the temperature's constant, and because their digestive system is incredibly efficient, they can just go down there and sit there. Like we were trying to trap them, and we were only legally allowed to trap them for like 3 or 4 days. Yeah, that's a great picture. And so they can just go and sit in their burrow and go, we don't care. You do what you want. So yeah, it was quite difficult to actually catch the animals that we wanted. But and so the next phase of this whole project is like, can we get another bigger area, because the area we've moved to them is a bit limited, and can we get them back out into the wild? But they tend to live in semi-arid areas. And one of the issues is because they're a grazing animal, they need a variety of natural plants, and in a lot of the areas where they're found, there's the buffel grass is taking over, and it's not really good nutrition for the wombats.
And this is one of the areas where we were talking about regenerative agriculture in the car, that there's a new trend for that, and that some farmers, and this is worldwide, I'm sure, just can't deal with all the paperwork and the costs and the fees, and even the subsidies won't get them going. So some of them have just been turning over their land to be completely rewilded, which I think is something that's being trialed in New Zealand as well, rewilding whole habitats in order to reverse the loss of original native species.
So one of the things I've been following in New Zealand, which I really, really like, it's called Predator Free New Zealand. And I think this is a brilliant initiative, because this could be a whole nother talk about the effect of feral animals on the Australian environment. But in New Zealand, the introduction of possums has been absolutely disastrous to the wildlife and to the environment. We've got stoats and those kind of mustelids, which are incredibly efficient killers that are out there attacking birds. And so I don't know where the initiative came from, but the New Zealand government wants to get rid of rats, mice, possums, hedgehogs, and all the mustelids. But so I actually volunteered a couple of years ago to go to Lord Howe Island, because there's 1913 or something, a ship was wrecked on Lord Howe Island, and all the ship rats got onto the island, and they were causing havoc with the native wildlife there. And so they were actually bringing expertise from New Zealand to Lord Howe, because New Zealand leads the world in protecting, and removing all these feral animals from islands, and they've been very successful in doing that. So that expertise was taken over to Lord Howe. Australia's also had an amazing impact on Macquarie Island, which is between here and Antarctica. So I think I've got off the subject a little bit.
Yeah. Sorry. So that was rewilding, that the habitat can actually recover quite quickly, by all accounts, if you just stop farming and do nothing. Butterfly species coming in that haven't been seen before, etc.
Well, there's a particular example of this guy in the UK that's done that, and it's just phenomenal what's the changes that have occurred and the interest that it's caused. And like, there's people coming from all over the planet now, before COVID, to actually come and visit this place where this guy's just let nature do its thing. And I think that's, to me, this is why we've got to stop interfering in the environment if we want to protect koalas and other Australian wildlife. One of the big issues here, of course, is like a lot of the smaller marsupials are really susceptible to feral cats, foxes, and that's a major concern. So we're seeing people like the Australian Wildlife Conservancy putting up these barrier fences and getting rid of the feral animals inside, and then the wildlife it's got a chance of actually coming back. And what we're starting to realise is just the environmental impact that those animals have, like turning over the soil, and just how it can actually promote the regeneration of the natural environment.
Hey, I just want to take over the conversation here. I just want to go back to developers. Some 6 years ago, I got the invitation to go down to our Logan Community Bank, and the usual suspects turned up. And we had a property developer. And it was really interesting to hear him say that, how many of you guys made money when you sold your home? That's an interesting question. He said, now, when you bought your original homes, you had no infrastructure. You had to go and put in your concrete driveways. You probably had bed sheets hanging in your windows. But now, as a developer, we have to put in all the headworks, underground sewage and water and power. And then it comes back to the fact that we've only got X amount of square meters to work with to actually sell a block, to actually recover our funds. So we can actually sell 70% of our property before we actually break even. Then he said, we're now talking about, did you notice there's something not right here? You there?
Yeah.
Okay, something's not right. Anyway, so he was saying to purchase a property now, he was telling us, council fees, state fees, the government fees, federal government with the GST in there. And then came up and said, what do you think we have to pay in all those outgoings before we can put a margin on the property that we're selling? I was quite surprised. This 390,000 bloody home had 85,000 attributed to those costs for councils and the state government and the federal government. That's a lot of money. So when developers start taking on board aspects of what we're talking about today, there has to be some flexibility in terms of any one of those three government infrastructures, to give them some freedom and some latitude as to what type of development. They've come up with a concept that they had to come up with a house that was for granny flat and then the normal house. And so that become a succession through the whole three families. When I say three generations of families, so grandma, grandpa, then they pass over, kids come through, they go into grandpa and grandpa's house. And then eventually mum and dad move into grandma's house, and the kids, whatever, take over the family home. So it recycles. So then we go to the next part of that's humanity doing development. Then we go out to the Darling Downs there, where we see all these oil and gas and fracking and all that stuff. Causes so much repairable damage to the artesian basin. And then we get a premier of Queensland, who's a Labor guy at the time, going in and filling up all the water wells, artesian wells, so that our livestock or even our nature animals haven't got a normal concourse to go through to actually go and get the water hole, because it's now being blocked up by man in terms of their fracking. Then we go to the next part of my conversation, what I consider to be the legend of this whole subject just before I interrupted, and the guy's called Peter Andrews. You know, he should be knighted 10 times over. Yes. Peter Andrews, amazing guy. The sacrifice that his family went through to be able to do what he did, and then get kicked to the curb by successive government bureaucracy. And thank God Jerry Harvey and Richard Platt, the billionaire bloke, came to the rescue there to give his concept of actually regeneration property, and exactly where this conversation is going on. This is the guy, legend, isn't it?
Yes, amazing.
Okay.
So for people overseas who don't know what Peter Andrews is doing, what is he doing? You've got that picture there, to go from
he showed you that
to restored landscapes.
So keeping the water on the land, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's the essence of it.
So his concept defeated all those bureaucracies who went to academic schools of learning. He came with basically lifestyle experiences. So his game plan was, see that arid ground there, we just keep on planting it and all that stuff. But what actually happens is they're breaking down the trees, and then the creeks dry up. So his first thing was to regenerate the creeks. So either you throw down rocks or you throw down timbers, which is natural, and they start creating little pools of water. When you get the pools of water, then you start getting other insects come along, and then the insects then start bringing in other forms of the cycle of other predators. And before you know it, you start bringing in the grasses. And he said, when you get the weeds, you keep the weeds, and then you let them grow to have it tall, and you just come along, and you cut, but you don't go down to the roots. You just make sure you got a stubble, and the remnants that you've cut stay on the ground, and it starts building up some humus, and it just carries on and builds up, and before you know it, you've got a restored landscape. I mean, the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Commission, did a show on him called Australian Story, and they showed you the photos of properties for miles and miles and miles, kilometres, square kilometres, miles, thousands, just up there on the left-hand side,
a desert.
And then you come into these two valleys, one owned by Jerry Harvey and the other one by Richard Pratt, lush green. It just showed you how you can do it naturally without a ton of money there. And thanks to Jerry Harvey educating the bureaucrats, this guy, I consider him to be the man of the hour.
Mm.
It sounds like you know the guy as well.
I've read a lot about him, man. But also, it's like you talk to his neighbours, and they'll think he's a nutter. And this is the same experience that happened in the UK, where this guy rewilded his property. He was struggling to make a living out of it, and yet his neighbours were still saying he was obliged to farm that land. And it's like the whole issue is that we can't continue in this way. And that if we keep going the way we're going, we're gonna run out of topsoil. We're gonna run out of the ability to feed ourselves. So, and the population of the planet is still increasing. So we need to be a bit more careful about how we grow our food. And I think part of that what we're talking about is stewardship, is that once we do start to take care of the land, then we can start taking care of the wildlife. And if we're talking about regenerative agriculture, it's amazing that farmers can dedicate 30% of their land to revegetation and still make a profit, and actually make more, do better out of it than if they just had these bare paddocks. And so I just see one of the big issues, you see with people struggling on the land is mental health and the suicide rate. And when you have this connection with nature, when you're doing these sort of things, it's amazing how you become more, it just settles you down. And I think we've got this innate human need to actually feel connected and to be part of nature. Mm-hmm. And the way we're going now is we're destroying it for whatever reason, mainly for profit. And like Julia, before you were talking about ecocide or genocide of the natural environment, I see that as like suicide for the human beings, like the way we're going. And one of the interesting things I had when I was looking at epidemiology is that because we're encroaching on the habitat of a lot of native species, the viruses and the other microorganisms that are in those animals, that's where we're getting exposed. So that's probably where coronaviruses come from. That's where HIV came from. There's so many records now. They're saying in the future 80% of the new infectious diseases are going to come out of wildlife, just because we're so meshed with them now. They don't have their own space. We're encroaching on their space so much more. Mm.
And as a vet, one of your things when you were looking at animal welfare was actually you said you can actually measure whether an animal's stressed or not. And the koalas are obviously all getting what is it, chlamydia, and apparently that's not because they're not doing anything different. It's just that it's a stress factor for them.
Well, you've got a really good example here in Queensland. There's an island called St. Bees where researchers have been there and they're studying the population there, and they've recorded that these animals are carrying chlamydia, but they're not. It's not manifesting as disease. So the bugs there, chlamydia are quite an unusual type of organism because they live inside the cells in the koalas, and I like to use this example of like a triangle that disease is a interaction between the organism, the animal, and the environment, and if that triangle gets skewed, then disease manifests. And this is what's actually happening in southeast Queensland now, is that because the animals are stressed because of their habitats but disappearing, we're seeing a hell of a lot more chlamydia. So the approach now is that, we should be vaccinating all these animals against chlamydia. So again, I just see that as like we're treating the symptoms again, and we're not getting at the actual underlying cause. And so to me, it's like, well, so you've got an animal that's vaccinated against chlamydia, and it's not going to be disease; it's still going to be stressed. So something else is going to happen with that. So this is the whole issue, that we're just upsetting the balance, and once that balance is upset, it's really difficult to restore it.
No, I'd actually like to check in on that in terms of animals being stressed. I know when you were in New Zealand, you were at that time New Zealand was still doing live exports of sheep, which I think Australia is still doing. I know that's a bit of a contentious issue at the moment. As a vet, you were tasked to go onto the ship with the sheep from all the way from New Zealand to
3 weeks,
for 3 weeks. Tell us what actually happens.
Where'd you go, Bender? Bahrain?
Saudi Arabia. I went to Riyadh.
Jeddah.
Jeddah. What I found fascinating about this is like these animals were going for the Hajj, so they're going to be slaughtered and then given to the poor. So they had to be intact male animals. So they had tails and they still had their testicles. And one of the big issues was with the ships we were on, we had like 125,000 sheep on this converted oil tanker. And where they used to have the oil, there was just all these pallets for feeding the sheep. And then above deck, there was a number of different levels of sheep. So providing the ship was moving, there was adequate ventilation for the sheep. As soon as it stopped, which was what happens when you get into the Red Sea and you get these what's called a hot fog, the animals can't lose heat, and they'll die of heat stress. But the interesting thing for me, because I was really fascinated by animal behaviour, is that the animals very quickly get adapted to the sound of the augers get turned on, and they know that the food's going to arrive at the trough. So all the big boys go and gorge themselves at the trough. The other guys, the smaller ones, they can't get any access to the trough. So the subordinate sheep were dying from starvation. You'd open them up, and it was like their whole intestinal system being scrubbed clean. There was just nothing in there because they were being prevented from eating by these other sheep, and that was something that we hadn't really detected before. And it's just another example of like, why are we exporting animals for slaughter when we could just we could slaughter them near where they're grown and send them meat. And
right, you're talking about claws and shipping there because they're the specialists in livestock. But look, I happened to be in Cairo some years ago, staying there, and they treated us with some sort of celebrity status, so we had to put in 35 Egyptian pounds. And one of the males went down to the auctions there and bought a live ewe, brought it back to the property, and then they got a halal butcher and was slaughtered on site. They hung it up in the doorway. They then got a barbecue plate out, and they brought out a stand-up a fan so they could get some breeze to get the coals going. and then they started to strip out the meat, and then they had the whole family, and they just came out and laid out all these carpets on the earth and that. And then because we were the overseas people, they were giving us the tenderloins, of the best part of the meat cuts. Then the men were fed, and then the women were fed, and the children were fed. It was just a sense of order, But it was their way of customs and culture about having something live that can say the prayers and the halal aspect to it.
Yep, and it's fresh.
Yeah, exactly right. So there is something to be said for it. I mean, in the abattoirs that I've seen in Australia and New Zealand, they get the Muslim kill guys to come in and do the slaughter at a certain time frame when they get
And the rabbis.
Yeah. So
Rabbis for the Jewish.
yeah. There's one rabbi guy come into Australia and he did his job and ran off. So they had to go and track him down. He wanted to stay in Australia. So it's there's a whole sense of process there when it comes to customs, isn't it? You try to tread very rarely, eh?
But this is the question, that's for the humans. But, if and you've obviously done behavioral science, and you can measure how stressed the animals are. So you've been into feedlots. What have you detected?
Well, one of my first jobs when I came to Queensland was looking at heat stress in feedlots, and at that time there was a lot of animals dying, and often they were English bred, like Angus cattle that have got a black coat, and they're standing out in this feedlot, no shade, and the temperature's really high, and they've got no way of moving out of that feedlot. So now they've got, they put misters and they put up shade cloth and things like that. But the whole intensification of animal production is where we're just causing a lot of problems. We're causing a lot of contamination of the environment. We're producing cheap food, but I'd really question like the quality of that food when you eat it. Like you can look at marbling scores and all that, and it's pretty good. But to me, there's been a lot of work just looking at like grass fed is probably better for us. And again, it's this thing of like quality, not quantity. The industrialization of food production is really causing so many issues for us at the moment, and I think that's just one aspect of it, the feedlot cattle, and the caged chickens are just one example of it, or two examples of it.
No, particularly when they put hormonal stuff into their feeds.
Yeah, well, look, these animals are designed to graze over vast distances, to eat high fibre diets, and we're feeding them on grains, and that grain could easily be fed directly to human beings. It's an inefficient process, but it's pretty well established in Queensland, that's for sure.
Yeah, because then with our wheat and all that stuff, and they store it, and all of a sudden we have locusts and we have
mice,
mice plagues, and so they put the whole silos into ammonium sulfate, and so when it gets covered in the shell and all that stuff, and they try and wash it off, they just can't get that ammonium sulfate off, and of course then people say you got gluten. No, you're not gluten intolerant, you're ammonium sulfate intolerant.
So I guess one of the point I do want to make is that you see it in any intensive farming, and like Tasmanian salmon's a big issue at the moment here. But like the same happens on piggeries. When you crowd all these animals together, the chance of transmission of disease is much higher. And so the animals aren't living in a natural environment. They can't get away from each other. And so rather than us changing the environment to suit the animal, we change the animal. Like we debeat chickens when they're in cages so they don't peck each other. We cut the tails off piglets so they don't attack each other. These sort of things happen, and I just feel like there can be a much more compassionate and humane way of actually producing food.
Well, you have to go into the mystical world and become a breatharian. So, you know, it's the case of meditating, and as the sun rises and you take the sun through your eyes and you take in the light. And I know a number of people have been able to do that and just drink water or sort of like a soup base for food, and they had remarkable bloody health issues being healed, and they become quite high vibrant beings, you know. I'm just throwing out a remedy there.
So, as a proportion of the population, Jeff, how many are breatharians?
No, it'd be like the guy Peter Andrews, you know.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
The next one they were saying, you can't believe it, but anyway.
Yeah.
So you just need someone to step forward to say, hey, there's another opportunity here, another way of looking at it.
Well, I just think it's like the answer is that we'd have to change the way we think about things, and I think at the moment it's so easy to stay in the old sort of ruts of, oh, this is the way we do it and this is the way it has to be done. And, you know, this is what I think, this is where I feel so optimistic about the younger generation, and particularly the school kids that are out protesting about global warming, things like that, is that people are starting to look, you know, in an innovative way as what we're doing and why we're doing it, and do we have to keep doing it this way just because we always have.
Well, it comes back to distribution, isn't it, and warehousing and how it's marketed, isn't it? So that's what we learned from our gentleman who came from the body shop, to get the farmers to come together and set up a cooperative, so they can actually maintain a good value for their product and also look after the distribution channels. Unfortunately, greed takes over, and someone from the ASX or NASDAQ or whatever comes along and says, look, we can give you a shitload of money as a cooperative and we'll turn you into a corporation. And of course, dairy farmers have done that, and then they've got wiped out with cheap milk.
Yeah, but I think there's also, you know, apart from farmers, you know, that more and more people are growing food in their backyards or setting up community gardens, or, you know, Allan's been involved in turning old farms back into native bushland. So there's, you know, huge groundswell of people actually taking action and doing that. And I think that's definitely something that we have to do. We have to get more hands-on. I think just donating money to charities who will adopt a koala isn't going to do stuff, because they just end up adopting koalas that are already in zoos. So, you know, rather than solving our cultures, we really have to take care of our backyards, you know, go out and look at the wildlife, see where it lives, get to know it, support it, and then occasionally do other things like Allan does, which is like go up to Gladstone Harbour, jump off a boat, try and catch a turtle, and relocate us. Can you tell us about that? I just love that story.
Well, no, again, it's like getting into this whole issue of you know, marine pollution now, but so we've got one amazing guy that's spent his whole life studying turtles in Queensland, and he's tagged turtles like 30 years ago and seen them come back. But again, the issue with global warming is that the sex of turtles is determined by the temperature of the eggs when they're incubating. So what we're finding now is that as the temperatures are rising, there's no male turtles being born. So people are starting to try and cool down some of these turtle nests so that some male turtles can be born. But so part of the research that I was involved with was going to Gladstone, which is a major industrial harbour, and in the harbour association, I'm not quite sure what the term was, but the Gladstone Harbour group were doing a survey to see what was happening with the turtles in the Gladstone Harbour. And the job that we're involved with was going out and catching turtles, weighing them, tagging them, and also looking inside them to see, you know, because if they're not fully grown, you can't decide whether they're a male or a female. And then if they were, and just looking to see whether their reproductive systems were active. So and at the same time, there was another university student there looking at heavy metals and things in the blood of these animals, just to try and get an idea of what's going on. So there's a lot of like I say, we're gathering a lot of data, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're actually doing a lot to actually change the situation. So,
but maybe coming back to the koala, so if people who are watching it locally in Brisbane, southeast Queensland, if they do find a koala that looks lost crossing the road or is orphaned, Allan, where do they take it to?
well, I think the key message is don't try and pick it up. You'll get ripped to shreds if you do. So there are what amazes me is that there's so many volunteer groups in Queensland which are on call, 24/7 to go and care for wildlife. So the one I'm most familiar with is the Ipswich Koala Protection Society. So they've got people that'll go out and pick up animals off if they've been injured on the road, or if they're in someone's backyard and they've been attacked by a dog, or if they're showing signs of chlamydia, they'll go out and they can set a trap around the tree and collect that animal and then take it for treatment. But sadly, what we found, like with over 90% of the animals that are attacked by dogs, they never recover. Their injuries are so bad. And often that's the case with animals hit by cars, that if they've got a broken jaw, it's very difficult to get that jaw aligned because the grinding of the leaves is so precise and has to be so fine that if the koala's jaw is slightly out of alignment, then they're not going to be able to survive in the wild. But the whole issue with the rescue of wildlife is to return them to the wild. So they'll be taken into care. There's a number of wildlife hospitals in southeast Queensland, and those animals are then returned. They're microchipped, so we can identify them if they come back in, and then they're released back to the natural habitat if they can be.
And then just to summarise, as we're coming to the end of the show, and you've been listening to Allan McKinnon, eucalyptus, or you take care of your backyard, catch animals there along the fence. That's what you're suggesting as well, isn't it?
Yeah, but I'd say don't just focus